Hello, and welcome to the Joy of CX. I'm David Cox, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about the final chapter in the transformation journey towards full customer centricity, the final piece of the jigsaw, the aspect of the internal culture of the business. It's this area that's probably the most misunderstood and also possibly the most important component of any transformation. So far on this journey, we've focused very much on our external relationship with the customer. We've talked about identifying and getting rid of the things that most annoy customers. We've covered creating a vision for the ideal company, the ideal experience that we want to deliver to customers, and how to go about integrating that vision into the reality of the business by redesigning the customer journey. But now what we're going to be doing is looking within. We're going to be looking at how we need to think about our internal culture in order for that external experience that we want to deliver to customers to be a natural expression of who we are as a business. When it comes to thinking about customer experience, this is an area that is often, if not almost always, overlooked. Most of my clients have never really considered the connection between employee experience and customer experience. Employee experience is seen as something separate, as something different. It's an HR issue. It's all about values and behaviors and so on. It's nothing to do with the experience that we want to deliver to customers. It's a completely separate chapter heading. At best, there's a bit of crossover where some kind of vague notion of being customer-centric is incorporated into the values and behaviors. But as we've touched on before, it's left as some sort of wishy-washy idea of treating customers better, serving customers' needs, going the extra mile, all of those sorts of things. But to me, the essence of being really successful in creating a lasting and sustainable customer experience is to make sure that your internal culture completely reflects what it is you want to be known for externally. As human beings, this is about making sure that the way we think and behave, our internal compass, is completely in tune with how we present ourselves to the world. That's when you get authenticity. And authenticity is what we as people respond very, very positively to. Or looking at it from the opposite perspective, if we're trying to present an image to the world which is not in tune with how we think, feel and behave, then it'll always show through. It'll feel jarring and fake. It'll be a turn-off. So what we're trying to do here is to move beyond the simplistic idea of being more customer-centric as an ambition towards really making sure that we align our internal culture with what we stand for, with what we want customers to love about us. So to use the example we've used many times, if we want customers to love us because we keep everything so simple, then we have to live and breathe simplicity internally, day in, day out. Every single person in the organization needs to feel that simplicity is something that we value, that we strive for. We all have to look to simplify everything we do internally on a day-to-day basis, simplify our internal processes, simplify our work, etc., in order for delivering simplicity to customers to become natural. So that's the Holy Grail. We're trying to reimagine the internal culture of our business so it will fit perfectly with our ideal customer experience. And by doing so, what we're actually creating is a spine, a unifying DNA, a unifying spirit that describes both how we are for our customers as well as how we behave internally. We're moving away from having multiple lenses and frameworks to having one unifying vision. Instead of having to think about our brand essence on one side, our values on the other, we have a single sense of why we exist and how we embody that. And this creates a sense of meaning and belonging that really energizes people right across the organization. A sense of connection to purpose that unites everyone and means that each individual can feel part of the whole. A situation where not only our customers love us, but our people love working here. That nirvana state where our people get out of bed in the morning with a spring in their step rather than that Monday morning dread. But we have to be realistic here. If we're going to realize that dream, then we have to recognize we're going to have to actively and deliberately create the culture that's going to get us there. And in my experience, this often means that there can be some big hurdles to overcome. The first of these is the question of who actually owns the culture. This can often be a tricky point. It sometimes sits explicitly with the HR department, but more often it's kind of owned unofficially by the management team or the CEO himself or herself. And more importantly than that, what I usually find is, regardless of who is nominally responsible for the culture, it's very rarely deliberately created, deliberately managed, deliberately fine-tuned. There may be a set of official values that appear on screensavers and posters across the office, possibly even a set of codified employee behaviours that support those values. But so often the actual culture on the ground has little to do with the aspirational values. I've seen several businesses that claim to be all about empowerment, whereas the reality in the day-to-day is a culture of command and control and management by fear. I mention all this because if we're going to go about trying to deliberately create an ideal culture that is completely aligned with what we stand for customers, then we have to understand which parts of the organisation we're going to have to bring along the journey in order to be able to tackle this. To recognise that there is likely not going to be a natural area that we can tap into to help to drive the sorts of changes that we need to make. And also that we're probably going to meet a fair degree of resistance, driven largely by a fear of tackling such a big, hairy, difficult topic like culture change. So how do we go about tackling it? How do we deliberately create the ideal culture? The first step is a careful definition, a precise articulation of what that ideal culture is. And this follows a very similar pattern, a very similar approach to the definition of the ideal customer experience. On the customer side, we took our core principles, the 3 or 4 things that define what we stand for, and broke each one into a set of customer commitments, the things that we need to sign up to in order for the principles to become a reality for the outside world. And we follow exactly the same approach for the inside. We start with the same 3 or 4 principles, and we break them down into a set of people promises that capture the essence of our ideal culture. Essentially a commitment on behalf of the company to create an environment where the way that we do things, the way we behave, the way we act, the way we think, supports the principle that we stand for. So let's use an example to try and bring this to life. I worked with a mobile operator in Brazil a few years back, and one of their core principles was to play fair. For customers, this translated into commitments like, we make sure everything's simple and clear, nothing hidden, no surprises. If you're not clear, it's our fault. And all our offers are available to everyone, and we give you a fair choice on what's best for you. But internally, we had to think about what a culture of fair play would look like. And we identified promises like, we actively encourage open and honest feedback at all levels. And when something goes wrong, we don't look for who to blame, we correct the root cause. So what we're doing is trying to articulate the kind of proof points of a culture of playing fair. We can only really be fair with each other if we're prepared to give honest feedback upwards as well as downwards. We can't be a fair culture if we're always looking for scapegoats when things go wrong, rather than addressing the root problem. So if the goal is to create this set of people promises that unpack the core principles into a set of proof points of the ideal culture that we need to create in order to align ourselves with our customers, the question is, what's the best way of going about doing this? From experience, I found the most effective way of going about this is slightly the opposite of what we did with the customer commitments. If you remember when we talked about customer commitments, I said that the most important thing was to get the management team involved in the creation of those commitments because they have to sign up to things that have a profound impact on the business. But when we look at the internal perspective, what I've found over the years is it's much more powerful to do it bottom up. So using your people to come up with their vision of their company that is shaped by the customer purpose and built around the core principles. What this does is break with the traditional approach of the values and behaviours coming down on tablets of stone from on high and reinforces a message of the power of co-creation that inevitably inspires belief and commitment across the organisation. From a methodology perspective, very simply, you're picking kind of mid-level people from across the business, both customer-facing and back-office roles, and running a workshop to come up with their people promises, which you can then play back to the management team to make sure they're comfortable with the vision and get their approval and sign-off, hopefully resisting the temptation to make too many changes and imposing their own personal beliefs and fixations. And then what you've got, if you can visualize this, is a single, consistent, coherent DNA, a spine of principles that unpacks externally into a set of commitments for customers and unpacks internally into a set of promises that define our ideal culture, our entire essence on a single page. But again, simply having a definition of the ideal culture doesn't make it happen. Cultures don't just happen by accident or by simply willing them into being. So what we need to do is to go about deliberately creating the culture that's articulated in these promises. There are two possible routes for doing this. I've tried them both, and there's one that's much more practical and as a consequence much more effective than the other. So the first is to go down the employee journey route. In the same way that we redefined our customer journey by applying the commitments, we go about redefining the employee journey by applying the people promises, trying to define the ideal recruitment experience, the onboarding, the experience of doing our jobs, of growth and development, and so on. But whilst this is probably the textbook approach, what I've found is that very often we're adding a layer of significant complexity to what can already be a slightly obscure and confused territory. It can become so academic that it becomes almost impossible for organizations, particularly HR areas, to really get on board with what we're trying to do. We're in danger of creating a bit of a monster. The other option is to take a bit of a shortcut that helps you to think through the problem in a more direct way. And this is by starting with a very simple gap analysis. So you take each of your people promises and you hold it up against your existing culture and you ask yourself the very basic question, is this true today? If we're being honest with ourselves, do we tend to point the finger and look for scapegoats when things go wrong? Do we encourage people to give feedback to their managers and so on? So we can identify which of the people promises of our ideal culture need something to change for them to become true in our day-to-day. And then we're faced with the slightly more complex question of what could we do, what should we do in order to create, to facilitate, to enable a culture where this promise becomes a reality. And here is where we've got to open our minds a little bit and to think carefully about all the different dimensions that have an influence on the prevailing culture, so that we can think about which levers we can or should pull in order to influence, change, update the way of being of the organization. I'm stressing this point because very often there's an assumption that there's a direct and singular association between employee behavior and culture. So in other words, there's a tendency to think that the only thing we have to do is tell employees to behave in a certain way, and that the culture of the organization will be some kind of emergent property of the way each person behaves. So then this leads to focusing on codifying correct behaviors, appraisals, evaluations, and so on, which is often also the comfort zone of the HR area of the business. And whilst it's certainly true that there are many employee promises where pulling the individual behaviors lever is definitely the most effective route. We want to stand for dependability, so we have a promise to always deliver on a deadline, for example. But there are other dimensions that we need to consider that would enable a more effective transition to the ideal culture. The first, and probably most important of these, is the way that the leaders of the business act, the behaviors that they role model. It's no secret that almost always the prevailing culture of a business, that is how things are done here, almost always holds up a mirror to or is a reflection of the person at the top. So the culture of the business so often reflects the personality of the leader and to a certain extent the leadership team. If I see my boss behaving in a certain way, I'll tend to emulate it to keep them happy, and this will filter all the way down through the business. So one of the key things that we have to address if we're trying to create the ideal experience is to make sure that the top team embody the spirit of what we're trying to create, that they become living, breathing human examples of the culture we're building. We can pull this lever of management behaviors through off-site team building, leadership coaching, and the like. The next thing we have to think about is what we might call management practices. This very often refers to reporting, KPIs, management committee structures, and even agendas. A business will tend to focus on whatever gets reported, whatever is top of the agenda in weekly meetings. So if that's all sales targets and cost control, and the customer's nowhere to be seen, you'll create a culture that naturally puts the customer last. Simply by changing the priority of what gets talked about and reported on, you can quickly change what's important to people in that business. And the final big lever that we need to consider here is the operating model of the business, how the organization is structured, what are the functions and objectives of each of the areas, and how they fit together. For example, if you're trying to create a culture that's open to failing fast and learning from mistakes, then maybe you need to create innovation cells within the organization to promote this kind of iterative learning behavior. So the goal here is to identify the gaps, the aspects where we're not living up to our promises, to work out which are the most appropriate levers to pull, and to identify the specific actions that can be taken to help the organization to move towards creating the ideal culture. It's a bit like the common approach to self-development at the personal level. The first thing is to recognize that we have a problem, say, with procrastination, realizing this is fundamentally about fear of failure. So we need to pull the lever of facing into our fears and taking action to commit to doing tasks that we find most difficult every day from 9 till 10, say. The absolute key here is to avoid the trap of thinking it's all up to the employees, that we'll reward them for good behavior and punish them for bad behavior. The challenge is to create an environment that naturally encourages and facilitates a certain way of being. And it's up to the leaders to create that by really examining the way their company operates and coming up with a program of simple changes that they can make to the way they act, that the business is run and organized, the way reporting is done, the way the employees are praised, rewarded, etc., etc. And if we do this successfully, what we're actually doing is to affect culture change without going down the typical road of employee engagement, internal comms, flag waving, and so on. We're not trying to encourage people to drink the Kool-Aid. We're trying to make it natural for people to behave in a way that's in tune with our principles. And if it feels natural to people, then it becomes easy. It becomes powerful. It becomes exciting. It becomes inspiring. And you're going to naturally create this world where your people feel completely connected to the purpose of your business and completely connected to your customers. And then you've got a totally sustainable, honest, powerful business that knows why it exists and delivers it. You've got all of these three fundamental and interlocking pillars in place. You're no longer doing anything that annoys your customers. You're creating an experience that's valuable and meaningful and makes emotional connection with your customers. And you've created a culture that fits with that, where your people feel connected to and are excited to come to work every morning with a genuine sense of purpose. This is the nirvana state, where we've genuinely created the truly customer-centric business, where all of the bits of the jigsaw fit together. We've become completely and utterly unbeatable. So with that, we've pretty much come to the end of our customer-centric transformation journey. But in the final episode of this series, I just wanted to take some time to draw some final conclusions, to look back over my 20 years of guiding businesses through this journey and draw out some key lessons that I picked up along the way, and also to look forward and talk about some of the opportunities that are coming down the track in the future. So many thanks for listening, and hope to see you soon.